Isaac, you gave also a solution. Okay. All right. So I'll tell you like this: every generation has to do two things. You have to sort of be unique, do something new, but also be nostalgic and familiar with the old generation. So it used to be in days of old, back in Europe, when the sky was still blue. So every shul, there's always two shiurim. In every shul, there's always two chaburas, basic. Nothing fancy. Daf Yomi Kim Masechta. There was Mishnayos and Ein Yaakov. That's all it was, Mishnayos and Ein Yaakov, every shul. Come to America, we've become very sophisticated, so Ein Yaakov is no longer in style. But I figured, you know what? Let's bring back the old a little bit with a more modern day twist. So what is Ein Yaakov? So again, for those that are not familiar, in Gemara, there's two parts to Gemara, basically. There's a number of parts, but one way to break down Gemara is two parts. There's the halachic part of Gemara, telling us the Torah Maisis, I guess you could call it, the part of Shas, the part of Talmud, which tells us how to physically keep mitzvahs properly. And then there's the Agadata, the part of the Gemara which is not halachic per se, but it's telling us Chovos Halavavis, right? The duties of the heart, the Chovos Halavavis, Hashkafik, Inyanim, things about the Rebbeinu Shloim, stories of tzaddikim to learn from. And so, Chazal say fantastic l'shaynos. Chazal say such things like, if a person wants to be makir mish amar v'haya olam, if you want to get acquainted with the one that said and the world came to be, if you want to become acquainted with God, then you have to learn Agadata, Chazal say. Now, what's interesting about learning Agadata is that the style of learning Agadata fundamentally is very different than the style of learning the halachic part of the Gemara. There's a number of differences. One fundamental one is the following, is that when it comes to learning the halachic side of Gemara, generally speaking, again, obviously you dig deep, everything is interconnected with each other, but generally speaking, the particular piece of Gemara that you're learning, that's the piece of Gemara that you need to know. You know what I mean? So you want to know, whatever the Gemara is discussing, halachas, whatever the case may be, the halacha l'maisa that's going to come out of it is from that Gemara. Yes, of course, every Gemara is interconnected, and the Rishonim will cross-reference other places. The Gemara is alive, but you don't have to know everything to know anything. That's usually the way it is. With Agadata, it's not like that. The way Chazal set up Agadata is that it's very difficult to truly pick up a hashkafas olam. Agadata is trying to give over who God is, and trying to give over a general picture of who the Rebbeinu Shalom is and how he runs the world, which is Pnimius HaTorah. That's the subject matter of Pnimius HaTorah. But the nature of that subject versus the subject of halacha is that halacha, by its very nature, is a subject matter which is in pieces. So you learn Hilchos Mezuzah is Hilchos Mezuzah, Hilchos Kashrus is Hilchos Kashrus. But the subject of God and how he runs the world is one sugya. And therefore, it's kaman impossible to just learn Agadata piece by piece and think that you're going to come away with an awareness of who God is. It's kaman impossible. And those that try to build a pure hashkafa simply from piecemealing Agadata together, what results from that is a very underdeveloped, half-baked philosophy of Yiddishkeit. The way to properly learn Agadata, therefore, this is the tradition. The way to learn Agadata really is by seeing Agadata in the framework to have a framework going into Agadata based on Pnimius HaTorah B'chlal. When a person has a perspective of Pnimius HaTorah based on Svarim and Kabbalah and so on, then you can study Agadata and you can see how each piece of Agadata is part of a bigger system. But to have the Chachma to see the bigger system just from the fragments of Agadata, that's very, very difficult. You have to have a very, very big neshama to do that. So that's why the learning of Agadata is something that people very often, especially in yeshivas, don't focus on at all, is because unless you have that proper background, each piece of Agadata is you don't even know how to make heads or tails of it. It's mamish a closed book. And so when Chazal say that to recognize Rebbeinu Shalom, you have to learn Agadata and so on, you have to learn Agadata understanding that you can't that what you need to know to understand this particular piece is not just the piece in front of you. It's coming from a bigger framework that Talmud Bavli in particular is going out of its way to hide. And so that's what makes Agadata a little bit difficult. So maybe that's one of the reasons why it went out of style a little bit. But like I said, so that section of Agadata, which is called, that section of Gemara, which is called Agadata, so there's a Sefer Ein Yaakov that was Ein Yaakov Betzim as a commentary on Agadata, but it became its own Sefer, the Sefer that was learned for many generations by people in shuls and kehillas and so on, of learning Agadata, learning the stories from the Gemara. So that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to, as Hashem, we're going to go through Wednesday nights. We'll go through Agadata, starting from Brachas, Daf Beis, and we'll go through Ein Yaakov as much as we can. But we'll try to investigate each particular piece, God's help, with trying to see it more than just that isolated piece, and to see it from the perspective of Pneumis HaTorah, and we'll try to at least gain insight of what's going on in these Agadatas. Okay. Why was it written like that? You could say it in two ways. Either way is true. One way to say it would be that Chazal went out of their way to hide it, in order, based on the general principle that we find in Masech Chagiga, and it was certainly the overriding principle for many, many generations, which is that these types of inyanim have to be hidden. And so Chazal throughout Bavli, recording Agadata the way it's recorded, gives enough of an opening for those that are of the initiated to see it openly. But if you're not initiated, then you don't see anything. And that's the chachma of what they did. And again, because Pneumis HaTorah has to be hidden. That's one way. And so that's one way to say it, that it was hidden in order to make sure that those that are not roy to understand would be like that. Another aspect of it is that that's the nature of Galus. I mean, that's Talmud Bavli is Yerushalmi is much more open about these things, but Bavli in particular, that's the nature of Galus. The definition of Galus is, sort of body without a soul, and hiding the Rebbeinu Shalom's presence, just like the Rebbeinu Shalom's presence is hidden in the world in Galus, so Hashem's presence, so to speak, is hidden in Torah as well. And that expresses itself by Agadata being a closed book, whereas Halacha, you have what to work with. It's not easy, but you have what to work with, at least to unpackage it. Agadata, by its very definition, you don't have enough material. That's why, but in a certain degree, just to flip it around, to a certain degree, that's why, to a certain degree, Agadata remains more authentically Torah Sheba'al Peh than even Halacha, because Torah Sheba'al Peh is something that you specifically need an oral tradition for, right? That's the way Torah Sheba'al is supposed to be. So even for Halacha, you still need an oral tradition. You still need that for sure. There are Chalimut and so on, but you could definitely, without a Rebbe, without an actual living Rebbe to receive from, you could do pretty good with Halacha. But with Pneumis HaTorah, with Agadata, you're not going to begin unless you have unless you're part of that Messiah. That's a living tradition of Torah Sheba'al Peh. So to a certain degree, the decree of Galus, which forces Pneumis HaTorah to be hidden, in truth, to a certain degree, also keeps the authenticity of Torah Sheba'al Peh alive. This is part of the way the Rebbeinu Shalom Fear developed, is that the Chayshich itself is the cause for light. And so this is the way it is also. The difficulty of Galus and the decree of keeping things hidden, Dafkin Pneumis HaTorah, is, in truth, keeping Torah the most authentic, the way it's supposed to be in Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay, so let's begin. So the first Agadata that we find in Talmud Bavli, which is, all beginnings are important. So even the first Agadata that's mentioned in Talmud Bavli is also important to know that this is the first Agadata. So the first Agadata is about the concept of there being mishmaros, of there being different watches in heaven, different shifts in Shemayim, that we'll see in a second, that Malachim take turns singing Shira to Hashem. But again, to get the background, so let's see some of the Marmakaimis. So Marmakah number 1 is the opening line of the Mishnah Maseches Brachas Beis Amud Aleph. Again, just enough background to get into the Gemara. So again, the Mishnah begins, well known, Me'emas Haikar Nishma Ba'arvin. So the Mishnah says, when is the proper time to say Kriya Shema at night? When's the proper, we know there's mitzvah saying Kriya Shema at night, Kriya Shema in the morning. So when's the Zman, when is the parameters of saying Kriya Shema at night? So it says the mission like this: the beginning of when you're able to say Kriya Shema at night is Misha Shakanu Nichnasim Lechel B'Trumasam. It's from the time where, let's say, you have Kahanim that became Tameh, and if a Kohen is Tameh, they're not allowed to eat Truma. So in order to become Tar, they have to go to the mikveh. That's step one. And step two, they also have to wait for sunset. Go mikveh, sunset, now they could eat Truma. So it says the Mishnah, the moment when a Kohen is able to eat Truma, in other words, the moment of sunset, when it becomes nighttime, that's the same Zman when you could begin to say Kriya Shema. Okay, that's in terms of the beginning. And how late can you go with Kriya Shema? Ad Saifa Shmur Rishayin, until the end of the first watch. That's different, Rebbe Eliezer. Okay, till the end of the first watch. Okay. Now we hold halach l'maisa. It's not the sugi for right now, but we hold halach l'maisa. The zman of Kriya Shema is all night long. But the opinion of Rebbe Eliezer, the first shita that's recorded in the Mishnah, is at the end of Kriya Shema you have until the end of the first watch of the night. So what does it mean the first watch? So obviously to know how many hours that is, you have to know how many watches there are at night, right? That'll tell you. So Marmukah number 2, the Gemara. So the Gemara in Daf Gimel Amud Aleph picks up on this. The Gemara says like this: My Kasav Rebbe Eliezer. What does Rebbe Eliezer hold? How many watches are there? Now we'll see in a second. The Gemara already had a tradition that there are two options. Either the night is divided up in Shemayim in terms of Malachim singing Shira to Hashem and taking shifts. So it's either divided up in 3 parts, and each watch being 4 hours long. Night is 12 hours, so each watch is 4 hours. Or the other possibility is that there are 4 watches at night, each watch being 3 hours. So it says the Gemara like this: My Kasav Rebbe Eliezer. What does Rebbe Eliezer personally hold? How many watches are there? I Kasav Sholosh Mishmaros Havi Laila. If Rebbe Eliezer is of the opinion that there are 3 watches at night, and each watch is consisting of 4 hours, then Leimad Arba Shoyos, and then just say straight away that Shema you can say until 4 hours into the night. What are you being cryptic about? The Kasav Arba Mishmaros Havi Laila. And if Rebbe Eliezer holds there are 4 watches of the night, then Leimad Sholosh Shoyos, then just say until 3 hours, right? Because then each watch is 3 hours. So either way, the Gemara is asking, what are you talking about watches for? Just say how many hours it is, 3 or 4, whatever the cheshbon is. The reason why Rebbe Eliezer holds these particular hours is because it says in Pasuk regarding Kriya Shema night, b'shach b'cha, that you should say Kriya Shema the time that people go to bed. So the question is, how many hours is it that people are going to sleep? People sleep the whole night, but when do they go to bed? Okay, so whatever it is, so you can make the argument it's 3 hours, you make the argument it's 4 hours. Whatever it is, why is Rebbe Eliezer talking about watches? Just say either 3 hours or 4 hours. So the Gemara says like this: La'olam kasav, the truth is like this. Really, Rebbe Eliezer, as we'll see in a second, is of the opinion that Sholosh Mishmaros Have Laila, that the night is divided in Shemayim in 3 watches, which means that each watch is 4 hours. So in other words, Rebbe Eliezer is saying that you could say Kriya Shema until the end of the first watch, until the end of 4 hours. Why are you talking about watches, B'chlal? Kamash Malon, the Ikka Mishmaris Berakia. You ignore that aleph. The Ikka Mishmaris Ba'ara. What he's trying to tell you is, besides talking about the halachas of Kriya Shema, he wants to sneak in another fact that you should know, that there is such an idea of there being watches in Shemayim. Time exists. Not time. I mean, that we should know, but in Shemayim, time exists, and it's we'll see in a second what the relevance is. That there are shifts in Shemayim in terms of malachim and so on. There are such an ideas as watches. The Tanya. And how do I know Rebbe Eliezer holds that there are 3 watches? Rebbe Eliezer says, there's a brayso that says the following: Sholosh Mishmaros Have Laila. He's not talking about Kriya Shema in this context. He says straight, there are 3 watches in Shemayim at night. I'll call Mishmar Mishmar. And with every single watch, with every single section, 1/3 of the night. So, like I said, the Malachim switch, they switch rotation to sing Shira. And at the same time, I'll call Mishmar Yoshev HaKadosh Baruch Hu V'Shai Kari, the Rebbeinu Shalom sits, and he roars out like a lion, as we'll see in a second, and he's crying over the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and over Galus. So it's a time when these watches are a time when the Malachim are singing Shira, and also the Rebbeinu Shalom is crying over Churban Beis HaMikdash and Galus. Shenemar, so Rebbe Eliezer said, because it says in Pasuk, Hashem Mimaraim Yishag, that Hashem from heaven, from a high place, calls out. From his sanctuary, he calls out his voice. He screams over his Beis HaMikdash. So it describes, so Elezer's point is, it describes Hashem calling 3 times. The word Yishag is 3 times. Yishag, Shayag, Yishag, it says it 3 times. That's a hint that there are 3 watches, and each watch, the Malachim are switching rotation to sing Shira, and the Rebbeinu Shalom is crying over the Beis HaMikdash. And that's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And when it comes to his point by Kriya Shema is you can say Kriya Shema until 4 hours into the night. But once he's giving you that time period of 4 hours, he slips in this remez that you should know 4 hours is significant because that's the end of the first watch. And there's an idea of having these 3 watches at night. Now, Tana Rabban, the Gemara now records another brisa, which is where the Gemara was coming from before, that there's actually a machlokes about this. The first, it says the brisa like this, Arba Mishmar Savi Laila, Divrei Rabbi. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was of the opinion that in fact there are 4 watches in Shemayim, 4 rotations of Malachim, and again, each Mishmar, the Rebbeinu Shalom was crying, but it's 4, not 3. Rab Nassan says the same as Rabbi Eliezer, Shalish, that it's only 3 Mishmars. Okay, so that's the sugya. So you have machlokes between Rebbe and Rab Nassan. How many rotations are there in Shemayim? Everyone agrees that there are rotations, and everyone agrees that during these rotations, the Rebbeinu Shalom is crying over the Churban Beis Hamikdash. The question is, are there 3 or are there 4? And it's not, from the simple reading of the Gemara, it is irrelevant really for Kriya Shema. It just happens to be, since Rabbi Eliezer says that the Zman of Kriya Shema is until 4 hours, and he happens to hold that's the end of the first watch, so that's how he says it to give us this hint. Why is it relevant for us to know what's going on in Shemayim during these changes? So the Rishonim explain that the relevancy for us is that if at these times the Malachim are singing Shira, that's not relevant for us. But if the Rebbeinu Shalom is crying at these times over the Beis Hamikdash, then that means it will be appropriate for us to do the same. And based on this, it says in Shulchan Aruch Marmukah number 3, the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, this is a Seminal Sif Beis, Hamashkim leschan lifnei bayrai. You don't have to do this as a Shulchan Aruch, but one that is interested in waking up early, before sunrise or in the middle of the night, to daven to Hashem. Yichavin l'shoyes shemeshtanes hamishmaris. It would be ideal that if you're going to daven anyway, to pick the moments when these watches in Shemayim are switching over. And we paskin, says the Shulchan Aruch, like Rabbi Eliezer and Rab Nassan, that there are 3 watches a night. And so those are the moments when these watches are switching. That would be ideal to daven for the following thing. Shem Shlish Halayla means the third of the night. Ulasayf Shnei Shlish Halayla, the end of 2/3. Ulasayf Halayla, at the end of the night. Those are the moments when the watches are switching. Shatfila Sheispal Ba'isam Hashais Al Churban V'Al Golas Ritzuya. To daven specifically for Churban Beis Hamikdash and Golas, that's the appropriate time. Why? Because that's the Rebbeinu Shalom was crying as well. So that's why it's relevant for us to know what's going on over there and how many watches there are. That if a person wants to daven for Churban Beis Hamikdash and to be misavel over the Golas, that's the appropriate time. That's when the Rebbeinu Shalom was doing it as well. Okay, fine. That's so in Ein Yaakov, in the Sefer Ein Yaakov, this is the first Agadata. There's any of the watches, the Rebbeinu Shalom crying. The machlokes, is it 3? Is it 4? Fine. So first of all, like, what does this tell us about the Rebbeinu Shalom? What's the avodah over here? Number 1. Number 2, what does this have to do with Kriya Shema? Again, in the simple reading of the Gemara, it doesn't have to do with Kriya Shema, but it's just once Rabbi Eliezer is telling us that the Zman of Kriya Shema is until 4 hours. Happens to be that's the end of the first Mishmar. So I'll hint to you that there's such an idea. But is there a way to really connect it to? Okay, so what we're going to learn is a Torah from Rav Kook. Rav Kook, it's interesting. The sefer that we have, there's a sefer that we have from Rav Kook on Agadata. It's not on all of Shas, but a number of Masechtas. It's called Ein Yaakov. Now this sefer that Rav Kook wrote, he wrote before he went to Eretz Yisrael, and you'll see right away, it's a completely different style of writing, I'll go upon him, than his other Sfarim. So his other Sfarim, once he stepped foot on the soil of the land, it's all poetry. It's mamish all. And by the way, it's interesting. The writings of Rav Kook in Eretz Yisrael, which is mamish poetry, that was his first draft. The Talmidim said he never had to go back and rewrite it. There were some secular authors and poets that Rav Kook was connected to that they used to claim, they probably weren't correct anyway, but they used to claim that maybe they could write as beautifully as Rav Kook, but definitely not first draft. That's what they used to say. Some even after many drafts they couldn't do it, but the writings that he has before, when he was still in Chutz La'aretz, is already, it's not Shiradik, it's more Chutz La'aretz. So, but we'll see. Okay, this is not again, this is a kitzer version of his Torah, but we'll do what we can. Okay, so in Ein Yaakov, Rav Kook is dealing with just this inyan of there being a machlokes, 3 watches, 4 watches. So this inyan is like this. Hine, Metzinu B'Merkava. So Rav Kook points out that in Sefer Yechezkel, in the first parak of Yechezkel, where it talks about Yechezkel's vision of the chariot of the Kisei HaKavod and so on. Yechezkel. The Haftarah for Teshuos. Yeah, exactly. So that in Ma'aser Merkava, that's what's called Ma'aser Merkava. So in that piece of Navi, the pasuk describes Yechezkel Navi seeing by the Kis Yaakov 4 different faces, 4 different malachim, carrying the Kis Yaakov. Shem Arba Panim, 4 faces. Pnei Shar, an ox. Pnei Aryeh, a lion. Pnei Nesher, an eagle, and Pnei Adam, the face of a person. Okay, those are the 4 faces that Yechezkel Navi sees. Now, let's begin like that. Kine. Chazal lamdo yisanu al pasuk belukim nasachayil. Chazal, in a number of places, based on the pasuk that says belukim nasachayil. With Hashem, we will be strong. It's a simple reading that pasuk is that Hashem gives us yat shmai to be matzliach. But Chazal darshan that pasuk means like this: belukim nasachayil, that we will give strength to Elokim. Elokim becomes strong because of us. What does that mean? Shebizman sheYisrael oisim ritzonish makim. So Rav Kook says, or Chazal tell us, that everything in Shemayim, all the kaiches and all the malachim, everything that's going in Shemayim, is based on our avodah down here. Bizman sheYisrael oisim ritzonish makim. When we do our avodah down here, we give strength to the heavens above. So all the malachim, all the kaiches in the Olam Yisrael are sustained and are invigorated and are given strength because of our avodah. Right? That's what we know. And we are the ones that sanctify and give strength to the higher world through our Torah, through our avodah. And the greater we are in our avodah, the higher world is also more complete. So the more we're complete in our personal avodah, the more the higher world is complete. Therefore, where Rav Kook is saying, therefore, if we want to know the matziv of our avodah down here, it would be paralleled by the matziv of the higher world. If the higher world is in good order, then that means things down here are good. If things are shvach up there, it means things are shvach down here. That's the way it is. V'hine. Huh?
The mirror universe.
Exactly. We are. It's avodah tzorch gavai. Chazal say such a lashon. That our avodah down here is necessary above. We're the ones that give the kaich up there. V'hine. So that's number 1. Number 2. Kishanavchin chelke hashleima surun l'adam. Says Rav Kook like this. Now, when you want to think about the different categories of our avodah down here, which each category will determine above whether they're doing well or not. So says Rav Kook, Kishanavchin chelke hashleima surun l'adam. When you categorize the different sections, I guess, in avodas Hashem, and you break it down of what how many sections there are in avodas Hashem that we have to perfect ourselves with. So you could come up with 4 different categories of avodas Hashem b'chlal. Ha'alef, the first section of avodas Hashem, and he's working bottom up. So the lowest, most basic and elemental madreg in avodas Hashem, hu shleimas havodah b'poil. That means practically doing what you have to do. L'kaim kol mitzvahs Hashem yisbarach, to fulfill all the mitzvahs you have to fulfill. U'lishon kol ma she'izr, and to avoid things that you're not allowed to do. So mitzvahs ma'asiyos. That's one shlav, that's one category, that's one section of avodah. V'habeis, the second section, hu shleimus hamidas. So the first section is maisa, the second section is your personality, your midas, to have good midas, to misak in your midas, l'lechs b'darkei Hashem, to go in the ways of Hashem, to be rachum, v'chanun, b'al chesed. Those are the midas. That's you see, we're moving from physical, from more very tangible to less tangible. So very tangible is mitzvahs maisim tovim. And then you go on to Midas Tovus. That's the second category of shleimus a person has to reach. Hagimel, the third category, hu shleimus yidiyas haTorah haniglas. That would be, now we're moving from action, emotion, now to the intellect. That your seichel, to become complete with seichel, means to become mushlam, to become complete in yidiyas haTorah, to learn Torah properly, and specifically haniglas, the revealed part of Torah, the kol partet with all of its details as much as you can. And by learning Torah and knowing Kol Torah Kula, it has an effect, first of all, that now you'll know how to keep the mitzvahs properly. That's number 1. But more than that, you become more complete. The more Torah that you know, the more your intellectual side of who you are, and that more spiritual side of who you are becomes complete. So your action, your maisim become complete through mitzvahs and maisim tovim. Your personality becomes complete through Midas Taivas, and your Seichel becomes complete through Yediyas HaTorah. Those are the first three categories. Hadalit, and the fourth category, Hu HaChoisem VaTachlis Shel Kol Sholosh Amailas HaKoidmes. The fourth is the Chasima, the seal, and really the Tachlis, where all these previous Madregas of Shleimus is really trying to get to. V'hapri hayotzimem, and the fruit that is the result of all the previous Madregas, is Shuladasas Hashem Yisbarach, is Devekas B'Hashem, is to attach oneself to God, to truly become someone who is attached to Elokus. And specifically, as we'll see soon, this is specifically by being involved with Pnimis HaTorah and Pnimis Tekavoida, Dvekas. Kedei lagil la'avasai v'yiras roi musai, to reach a level of Havas Hashem and Yiras Hashem, uladas d'rachav Yisbarach, and to know the ways of Hashem. Shutach l'shleimus adam, and that's the full expression of the shleimus of a person. Now, this is also part of Torah, as we'll see soon. This is fully captured by learning, by not just learning intellectually, by living Pnimis Torah, by learning Pnimis Torah and living a Pnimis Avayda. That's the shleimus. So the first three madregas by themselves are, you're still sort of on your own. You know, you're doing the right thing. You have good midas, and you know a lot of information that you need to know in order to function properly. But the Rebbeinu Shalom is still an idea, you know, that you're serving. But in terms of real dvekas and living with the Rebbeinu Shalom, that's the fourth madrega that's deeply rooted with, again, Pnimis HaTorah, Pnimis Avayda, and so on. V'nevar b'zeh shemas dalat upon kulam. Now with this, we could then say, again, everything in Shemayim is reflective of down here. So when Yechezkel Navi sees these four different malachim, or four different categories carrying the Kisei HaKavod, that's reflective of the four different madregas and four different categories of Avodas Hashem down here. And based on our Avodah down here, each one of those marachas, one of those systems in Shemayim, will be complete or incomplete based on our Avodah. So he says like this: with this, we could explain these four different sides of the higher world that Yechezkel Navi saw. Pnei Shar, the ox that Yechezkel Navi saw, that corresponds to the aspect of the higher world which is dependent on our avodah in terms of mitzvahs ma'asis. Why is that called a pnei shar? Kenyan roiv tu is b'koich shar, because an ox is associated with agriculture. It means lemaisa, like actually having the tvu and peiros and so on. That's practical. It's tangible. That's what the shar represents. So the pnei hashar in Shemayim represents that part of the higher world which is b'shleimus when our mitzvahs ma'asis are b'shleimus. That's dependent on our mitzvahs ma'asis. That's number one. Pnei Aryeh. What is the Aryeh? What does the lion represent? Shuel Yemin in the Ma'aseh V'Cheskel. So the Aryeh is on the right side. Meir Chesed, that represents the Midah of Chesed, which is, or the Rav talks about over here, which is the example of Midas Taivas. Ultimately, all Midas Taivas boil down to a sense of Chesed and a sense of empathy and so on with other people. So the Aryeh represents that side of the higher world, which is dependent on our avoid in terms of Midas Taivas. V'umelech HaChayis, interesting, he says the lion is the king of all the Chayis, as we know. Hamakalim Chiyusim Roiv Chesed. And you should know, of all the animals, the Chayis are the ones that are sustained through Hashem's Midah of Chesed in the most extreme way. Why? Because Chayis usually are wild and destructive. So why would the Rebbeinu Shalom give them food? It's one thing if the Rebbeinu Shalom is mafarnis, gives parnasa to a little bunny rabbit. They're nice and cute. They're harmless. Or the Rebbeinu Shalom gives food to goats and sheep. We can use them. Why is the Rebbeinu Shalom sustaining wild animals that are destructive? The answer is the Rebbeinu Shalom is Baal Chesed. So of all animals, Chayis expressed the Rebbeinu Shalom's Chesed, and the Aryeh, which is Melech HaChayis, so that's going to be also the expression of the highest level of Chesed. So again, the Chayis rights are not used by people, so there's no really. So it's just a pure act of Chesed. The fact that Rebbeinu Shalom sustains them. So that's the second category of Pnei Aryeh. Pnei Nesher. What does the Nesher represent? The eagle that flies up high. That's both connected to the ground, but also goes high. Mechavi neged shleimus shel esek atar ma'asis. That represents a shleimus, or that category of Avodas Hashem that's connected to a person becoming sholem in his Yediyas HaTorah, but the Yediyas HaTorah that are relevant to mitzvahs ma'asis. So on the one hand, it's an intellectual inyan, so it's high. it's more esoteric. But on the other hand, the subject matter is down to earth. So you're learning about Hilchos Tzitzis. So you're learning, so it's more, it's not physical, so it's himmeldik to a certain degree, but the subject that you're learning about is still practical. So it's like the bird that exactly. So it goes high, but it goes low. So that's the nesher. Shleimus ha'askola, this is the represents the shleimus that a person can reach in seichel. Shu tzad hamayla, which on the one hand is very high, v'achona l'kabel ha'maskol so yoser l'yainis, and allows the person to reach high places in seichel. But on the other hand, again, the subject matter that you're learning about is down to earth things, practical things. So that's what the nesher represents. The chelak ha'mechavi neged ha'tachlis ha'achrayna, and the fourth, representing the shleimus adam, a person that's altogether elokustic, that's altogether dvekistic, no longer just things of this world trying to be yaitze his chiyuvim, but living a life of dvekis and pnimius. Hakelel says kulam hu pnei adam. That is the face of the person. Shleimus adam hamiti, which is representative of what a person adam hashalim is. Ladas is Hashem yisbarach yidi amitis lefi kaycha adam. To know Hashem in the as much as it is humanly possible. Okay, so that's the four sides of the Merkava, representative of four aspects of the higher world, which depends on four aspects of our Avodah. Now, okay, next part. And now the Mishmaris in Shemayim, as I said before, is when the Malachim sing Shir. What's the Inyan of a Malach singing Shir? They're into music. What's the Inyan? So he says like this: Vine, Hashir. He's going to tie them all together soon in a bow. Vine. Hashir Meir Ashlemas. Shir, song, is always an expression of when things are complete. In other words, at the end of something, Baruch Hashem, you look back, mission accomplished, you sing a song. Shir always represents Shlemas. Therefore, so he says like this, we know that again, in Shemayim, like we said, what's the koiches that are being given to the higher world depends on our avodah down here. Our avodah primarily is during the daytime. That's when we're involved in avodas Hashem. So during the day down here, that's when things are still shaking and moving in Shemayim. By the nighttime, that's already when now in Shemayim they can look back at the day and say, oiskepalt, alles is good. That's when the nighttime is. So it's the nighttime, that's when there's going to be a time of Shir B'chlal. Because again, Shir means Shleimus, and Shleimus is only when the avodah is over. And the avodah primarily is during the day, so that's not a time of singing, that's a time of working. By nighttime already, we can look back at the Shemayim, can look back in the day and say, Klal Yisrael were piled good, so it's good for us too. So he says like this, singing is an expression of things being complete, things being done, and looking back and saying Gaval. This is why the time that we find in Shemayim the expression of Shleimus is dafka at night. Because that's the time when they can so fully process the shleimus that they received based on the avodah of the Jewish people the preceding day. Right? Again, and each category in Shemayim will sing a shira reflective of the particular shleimus that they received based on that category of avodas Hashem down here. So in other words, the Pnei Shor will sing in Shemayim based on the avodah of the Jewish people that day in our mitzvahs ma'asiyos. The Pnei Aryeh will sing in Shemayim, that category of malachim, will sing in Shemayim based on the shleimus of our avodah in terms of midas tovos, v'chulu v'chulu. Okay? So in other words, what Rav Kook is saying over here is like this. We're not just doing stam malachim up there. When in Ma'asim Merkava, when Yechezkel saw these four malachim, these four different categories, that is the entire system of malachim, because that is reflective of the entire system of our avodas Hashem. And so, and the singing of each one of those categories of malachim is going to be reflective and a simcha over the shleimus of avodah that the world brought to them through the avodah of that preceding day. Follow? Okay.
Why would they be equal?
Huh?
Why would each thing be equal? One section might be greater than the other. It could be that one particular day, the shira of the shar will be very, very loud, and the shira of the nesher may not be. But whatever degree, They're all like the same version. That's in Shemayim. That's how it will be. But in terms of the tekifas, it won't be the same. But listen, at the end of the day, each section of Avodas Hashem will, on some level, be accomplished. So there'll be some degree of shir for each one. So this is where we are beginning to now see the inyan of the mishmaris in Shemayim. These mishmaris in Shemayim, says Rav Kook, are going to be reflective. Each mishmar is going to be one of these categories of malachim, singing over the shleimus and expressing simcha over the shleimus that they received at night based on the avodah of the previous day. So how many categories of malachim are there? 4. Okay, so now we understand the shita that there are 4 mishmars. What's the meaning of 3 mishmars? So it says like this: Vine. I'm sorry, 1 second. Yeah, fine. Vine. Yeah, Vine. The second line, the second last paragraph, second line. Vine. Okay, so now with everything we said, now let's make another point. Says Rav Kook, Klal Yisrael can be divided into 2 camps. Every single Jew has to serve the Rebbeinu Shalom in all 4 categories. But there are 2 categories with Klal Yisrael. So he says like this: that highest madrega that's called the Pnei Adam, really dveikus, ahavas Hashem, yiras Hashem, a sense of being with the Rebbeinu Shalom and understanding the Rebbeinu Shalom. Hamayla yoser shlema, the highest madrega really is she'ia kol poyel mishleishes chelke apulas hakoydmais achuzim uklulim bezeh tachlis. The highest madrega, says Rav Kook, in the real healthy, holiest way to serve Hashem is that there really are not 4 categories. The most wholesome way of experiencing Yiddishkeit is that this highest madrega of dveikus b'Hashem is something that you experience in your mitzvahs ma'asiyos, is something that you experience in your midas taivas, is something that you experience in your learning halacha l'maisa. That it shouldn't be a separate category. That's the way it's supposed to be. In other words, this idea that there are 4 mishmarat, that there are 4 different categories, kilu. When I'm doing mitzvahs ma'asiyos, it's just dry and dead. When I'm working on my midas, it's just because I have to work on my midas. When I'm learning halacha, I'm just learning halacha. And then in moments, there's a shal shudis, there's a moment of dveikus. That's a time of pnei adam. That's chaval. It's not terrible, obviously, but it's chaval. That's not the way it's supposed. The way it's supposed to be is that pnei adam is supposed to be enlivening every single one of the first 3 madrigas, to such a degree that it's not a separate category. It's the neshama behind the pnei shar, the pnei ari, and the pnei nesher. So he says like this: Nachmu, there are 2 madrigas to avodas Hashem. The first madrega is kizu tachlis ha'achreina, that this highest madrega that we've been talking about, the tachlis, she'yedias Hashem Yisbarach, which is awareness of Hashem, pnei adam. Hamayla yoser shleimihi, the real way, the most, again, the authentic version of Yiddishkeit is she'akol poyel mishleishes chelke apulas l'kaydmis, that every one of the first 3 categories of mitzvahs and maisius and midas and seichel of Torah, achuz meklulim is that tachlis, are inter-included in that 4th one, to the point of where there is no 4th category. Shila das is Hashem. The kol kach yigbar arhu aliki al nefesh, and the light of Hashem should be so intense on the neshama, shekol ma shetasem ela, that everything that you're doing anyway with mitzvahs and midas and learning halacha, takir by kavod Hashem Yisbarach, there should be an awareness of the Rebbeinu Shalom's presence. That's the way it should be. Uleish asher hagiya lezois hamayla, to such a person that reached such a level, then there is no 4th category of Pnei Adam. The Pnei Adam is inter-included within the first 3. They're all inter-included in that Pnei Adam. So here's the Nakuda. That's true that's the ideal version of Yiddishkeit, and that's still true by Tzaddik Emes. But Lamaisa, the Amida that we find by most Yidden is not like that. Sheyask of mitzvah Torah, the Tikkun Amidas, the Chacham Satayr Niglas, that they're involved with mitzvahs Maisis, Baruch Hashem, and Midas Taivas, and they learn halacha. Kedei las is Ratzon Yotzra, because they want to do the right thing, they have to be Mekayim the mitzvahs properly. Umezeh Yiskali Itim, and every once in a while there's Zaycha to experience a Pnei Adam moment. Gamkin Yidis Hashem Yisbarach v'yafir all of our Hashem lahaskal ba'amita, and there's every once in a while they experience the light of Hashem to allow them to be an Adam, to allow them to experience the Pnei Adam. For such a person, which is the majority of Yidden, unfortunately in Galus, Hamailas Chalukas L'Daled. There are 4 categories. In other words, what Rav Kook is hinting to is the aside that we find by the Mekubalim is that don't just think of the higher world and this world. Every single neshama, every single Jew has his universe above. And so how many malachim, how many mishmaris are there in your Olam Ha'elyon? That depends on your avodah. Not only does the health of your higher world depend on your avodah, but how many categories of malachim depends on your avodah. If you're if you're serving the Rebbeinu in such a way that your mitzvahs ma'asis, your midas, and your learning of Torah, halach and so on, niglas HaTorah, is with a sense of dveikus b'Hashem and it's lishma, then in Shemayim you only have 3 mishmaros. But if you are learning, if the person is learning, which is again the madrega of most Yidden in Galus, that it's divided. Mitzvahs ma'asis are done, but they're not done with dveikus. Midas tovus and seichel of Torah, they're all dry. Then every once in a while there's a Pnei Adam experience. Then your Shemayim is of 4 mishmars. So how many are there of that? Okay, so by the times of Galus, the Roiv of Klal Yisrael in Shemayim are 4 mishmars. The Yechidei Skula only have 3 mishmars. So it says Rav Kook, this machlek is back to Chazal. That Rebbe says there are 4 mishmars. Rab Nosson and Eliezer said there are 3 mishmaris. So he says, this machlek is in Gimel mishmaris. Eidalid, Elov Elov Derlikim Chaim. They're both true. The higher world, which is related to Shapulas Anshe Maila, to the higher world that's being built and that's being completed by the Avodah of Anshe Maila of Tzadikim, Magia Shama, that the Tzadikim reach their particular place in Shemayim. Ein Nechlakis Kiyem Legil Mishmars. They only have 3 mishmars. But the level of Shemayim that's built by the collective whole of Klal Yisrael, in Golas, the collective tzibur are not holding by 3 mishmars. We're holding by 4 mishmars. Nechlagul Daled mishmars. Now Rav Kook goes on to say, it's a beautiful thing. It was the end of the page, so I couldn't type anymore. So I had Rahmanis on you also. But the end of the piece, Rav Kook goes on to say, so you have such an interesting thing. So what is it? So what does it boil down to? Because this is a machlekes that's negeh halach l'maisa. So how do we paskin? 3 mishmars, 4 mishmars. So it's interesting. So he says that such a shaila really would be similar to the general machlekes and shaila of we paskin like Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel. Why? The Gemara says we're going to Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, that Beis Shammai mechad ditzvei. Beis Shammai were sharper, but Beis Hillel were practically the roiv. So here you have the following scenario. The tzaddikim really are getting it right. That's the way it's supposed to be, but they're few in number. So the tzaddikim, to them, there's gimel mishmaris, and the hamoin am are not the authentic way it's supposed to be, but al kol panim they're the roiv. They have 4 mishmars. So when it comes to Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, who do we paskin like? Always Beis Hillel, which means that despite the fact that Tild Mashiach, but despite the fact that we'll see in a second, but despite the fact that Beis Shammai is mechad titzvei, you go with the Rabbim. What's ironic over here is that over here, how do we pass in the Shulchan Aruch? We pass in Gil Mishmar Savi, which is true only by the tzaddikim, not by the Amayna. So Rav Kook doesn't make this point, and he doesn't solve this observation. You follow the shtickle steer. Sorry? So that's a good point. Let's see if he can come in. So here's the thought that I was having. So again, to break it down. So what do we have over here? And let's appreciate this, by the way, just to go back. We said in the beginning, during these watches, so there's 2 things going on. Malachim are singing Shira, and the Rebbeinu Shem was crying over Galus. So these 2, it's a little bit opposite. It reminds you of a little bit of that story by the second Beis Hamikdash, right? The pasuk says in Ma'aser Ezra Nehemiah that the second Beis Hamikdash was being built, was being dedicated. So the pasuk says that the young generation were singing and dancing, was gevaldik, and the older generation beginning to cry. Why? Because they looked at it. They say, "This is what a Beis Hamikdash is to you. We remember Beis Hamikdash Rishon." So it's an amazing thing. The Malachim are mamish b'simcha. Whether Gimel mishmaras, Daled mishmaras, they're b'simcha over the avodah of the day. And the Rebbeinu was saying, "That's avodah. That's avodah." It's like his mamish crying over the Churban Beis Hamikdash. So it's like this. So again, so it comes at an interesting thing. Again, how many mishmaros are there? They're both true, but it depends on the Yichidei Skula. It's going to be 3. Tzaddikim is going to be 3, because again, by them, every mitzvah that they do is saturated with dveikus. Every midas toivus that they work on is saturated with dveikus. Every din halach and shulchan aruch that they learn is saturated with dveikus. So there's only 3 mishmaros, and by the Hamoinam, it's not like that. So there's 4 mishmaros. So again, usually you would go with the psak of the Hamoinam. Ma'aseh they're the Rabbim. Just like Beis Hillel over Beis Shammai, despite the fact that Beis Shammai is Mechad Titvei, sharper, we go with Beis Hillel, that's the Rabbim. Ironically, over here, when it comes to knowing, like the Shulchan Aruch said, of what? That to know when you should have a veilus over the Beis HaMikdash, we go with Gimel Mishmaros. What's Pshat? So there's different ways how to say it. First of all, again, it's a very good observation that who's getting up to be Masavel over Yerushalayim? Stam Tzaddikim. Okay. You can make the argument they're not, okay, but that's one possibility. Yeah. So the Tikkun Chatzos, that's Enochanami. That maybe we'll see maybe next time. Tikkun Chatzos is the middle of the second watch. So this we'll see about that. But I was thinking the following thing, because there's another shaila. Again, remember the other question we asked is, why does Rabbi Yezer Dafka feel compelled to mix this with Kriyishma? So my thoughts like this. Whenever you have Avelis, there's always 2 types of Avelis. There's an Avelis crying of Yish, of like, Chaval al da'avdin v'loy mishtachin. It's gone, it's lost, finished. And then so there's one way to cry over Gullus, which is that, like, it's done. It's done. Like, we can never get it back. Chas v'shom. But that's not the way it's supposed to be. The crying over Avelis is a crying that's steeped in hopefulness, and not only in the hope that we'll get it back. See, the ultimate ability to cry with the Beis HaMikdash in a way that's healthy is to realize that behind the scenes of all of our avodah is the dveikus. The real gullus is the fact that we don't see it. In other words, what's the ikar gullus of why is Rebbeinu Shalom crying? Rebbeinu Shalom's crying is because Pnei Adam is not complete. That's when the Hamoinam is crying. The Hamoinam, the gullus Hashchina by the Hamoinam is that there's 4 mishmaros. Yeah, so 4 mishmaros. If we the way to be masavel over Yerushalayim properly is to realize that even when you experience 4 mishmaros in your life, you have to believe that be'emes and pnimius, even by you, there's only 3 mishmaros. When a person thinks that in their life, be'etzem, there's 4 mishmaros, and dveikus b'Hashem is something that they only experience once in a while, then when they're crying over their galus and their distance from their Rebbeinu Shalom, that's going to be a crying of yish. But if a person realizes that despite the fact that I don't feel it, and despite the fact that in chitzainis and might look to the outside or to the superficial way of thinking that I have 4 mishmaros, a person, in order to be mesavel over Yerushalayim properly, a person has to believe that in pnimius, the Rebbeinu Shalom is saturated in my avodah. Every single mitzvah that I do is saturated with dveikus b'Hashem. Every mitzvah that I'm working on is saturated with dveikus. Every seichel of Torah and Nicholas that I'm learning is saturated with dveikus. And then, so what's the galus? The galus is that I'm not experiencing the truth of my avodah. So then when you're crying, it's not a crying that has anything to do with yish. It's not a crying of like, I don't have it anymore, I hope one day to get it. That's a crying of that's full of hope and full of and pushes you to bring gula into your life. Because it's not coming from a place of yish, it's not coming from a place of true distance. It's coming from a place that I am not sensitive enough to realize what I'm doing. In other words, here's the point. If Avelus over the Churban Beis HaMikdash would be with 4 mishmaros, then the crying would be, Rebbeinu Shalom, we're so far from you, and even in my avodah is dry and dead. So that the Avelus over such a situation very easily would turn into yish, because I'm starting off with an assumption that Rebbeinu Shalom is distant from my life, and then I compound that with all of the tsaros of Golis that I'm seeing, and the Hester Ponim, that now the divide between me and the Pnei Adam is like insurmountable. So it might turn into Yish. In order to be Mesavel of Yerushalayim properly, that the Avelis shouldn't be a state of Yish, then a person has to what? A person has to have the Emunah that even though it would seem that Al Pi Roiv we'd have 4 Mishmaris, but even the 4 Mishmaris that the Rabbim have, in Pnimius, even they only have 3 Mishmaris. And so this is why Davka, this inyan of 3 Mishmaris is how we paskin. And specifically, not only do we paskin like this by being Mesavel over Yerushalayim, that again, to make sure that the Avelis over Yerushalayim is not a crying that might lead to Yish, but rather a crying that leads to doing something about it. To make sure that the crying over the Churban Beis Hamikdash leads to a sense of being driven to do something about it is by realizing that you have everything you need in front of you. It's just a matter of harnessing it properly and seeing it properly and digging deeper. But if the Rebbeinu Shalom, if the Avelis is coming with the perspective of 4 Mishmaris, that even my avoida, even if I were to work on my mitzvahs and my midas and my seichel, even then the Rebbeinu Shalom is distant. So then you're going with a mindset. And put it this way again. Going into Avelis over the Beis Hamikdash with a mindset of the Rebbeinu Shalom actually being distant from your Avodah is a very dangerous thing. Because if you're going into Avelis over the Churban Beis Hamikdash with a mindset going in that the Rebbeinu Shalom be'etzim is far from you, and you compound that with crying and thinking about the Holocaust and crusades, well, guess what? That's going to turn into Yish. But if you go in, so how do you go into Avelis properly? By realizing that even though it should be that I have 4 Mishmaris, in Pnimius, even I have 3 Mishmaris. And I might not realize and feel the Dveikus B'Hashem in my mitzvahs ma'asiyos, but the Rebbeinu Shalom is there. Which means I'm going into Avelis of Churban Beis Hamikdash while what I'm crying over is not the actual distance of the Rebbeinu Shalom, but the hiddenness of the Rebbeinu Shalom. That the Rebbeinu Shalom is hidden from my eyes and hidden from my Avodah, but not that he's actually distant from my Avodah. If you go into your Avelos with a sense that the Rebbeinu Shalom is actually disconnected from your Avodah, and then you cry over Churban Beis Hamikdash, that's going to fall into Yish. This is why Rabbi Eliezer Dafka hints to this side, that we should paskin based on Rabbim, based on the Rav, that there are only 3 Mishmaris. He hints to this in the halachas of when to say Kriya Shema at night. Because what's the meaning of nighttime? Nighttime is Golos. What's Kriya Shema? Amunah. The Rab Tzadok writes, famous piece from Rab Tzadok, I'm surprised it's not a song already, but the famous piece from Rab Tzadok, that just like, listen, I lay down hints. Just like a person has to believe in the Rebbeinu Shalom, Kishem she'tzarech adam lahamin b'HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kach achar kach tzarech lahamin b'atzmai. Part of Emunah b'Hashem is to believe that the Rebbeinu Shalom is deeply connected to your life. And so Davka, by Kriya Shema at night, it's not just believing in God, it's also believing that God is be'etzem not distant from your Avodah, he's just hidden beneath the surface of your Avodah. So the part of the Emunah of Kriya Shema at night is to believe that there are only 3 Mishmaris even for Klal Yisrael, even for the Rav of Klal Yisrael, not just for the Yechidei Skula. So this is Hagufa. Rabbi Eliezer is not just B'derech Agav. I'll mention this idea that there are 3 Mishmaris. No, that's one of the ikar content of what it means to have Emunah, Beleilos, Emunah at night, which is Kriya Shema at night, is to believe this Nakuda, that although it might seem on the surface that in my world there are 4 Mishmaris, and the Rebbeinu Shalom, which is the Pnei Adam, is fundamentally disconnected and different from the rest of my Avodah, I have to have Emunah in nighttime, that even for myself, there's Gilum Mishmaris. And not only is that a necessary component for my Emunah at night to survive Golos, I can then, that's what allows me to actually mourn over Golos. Because then the mourning over Golos is not mourning over an actual being, kicked out of Hashem's classroom. It's that the Rebbeinu Shalom is hidden from my eyes. And then it's not a yishtika crying. It's a crying of like, I have to do something to see the truth. So there's no distance. It's just a matter of revealing the truth, which is just concealed by Golos. And that's the Ikar Avodah what we're learning from this. That's why, just to end off with one other Nakud of Pnimius, the first Tana that's mentioned in Talmud Bavli. And again, why is this the first Agadah of Talmud Bavli? Again, what's all of Agadah? Agadah is about
to recognize the one that created the world, to see the Rabbanu Shalom. The first lesson is that even if you don't see the Rabbanu Shalom, that's not because he's not there. It's because you just don't see him. But there's no such thing as Rabbanu Shalom be'etzem being fundamentally distant from you. That's why, again, the first piece of Agat in Talmud Bavli is that even though it should be that we should paskin that Roiv of Klal Yisrael have 4 mishmaros, we paskin even all of Klal Yisrael only has 3 mishmaros. And that's the chizik that Talmud Bavli, the first piece of introduction to Rabbanu Shalom that Talmud Bavli gives us is that he's everywhere, and there is no space that's outside of his presence. Less asar panimine, sayiv kalam and malik kalam, and that's the first piece of Torah's Talmud Bavli. And Befrat, by the way, this is why the first Tana is Rabbi Eliezer. I can't say this is why, but the Remez, I guess you can maybe add, is that the Arizal writes in Shar Gugulim that Rabbi Eliezer was a nitzutz, was a spark of Shevet Ruvain, of the actual, Ruvain ben Yaakov, the person Ruvain, which is ironic because Ruvain, what's the meaning of Ruvain? Ruvain means Re'iyah. Ruvain means to be able to see. And so the first mimer of Rabbi Eliezer, which certainly is coming Misharish Nishmasai, is trying to convey this message, which is that even if you don't see it, it's just a chesaron in your Re'iyah. It's just a chesaron in your Re'iyah. But the Rabbanu Shalom is there. What you need is just better eyes. That's the Nakuda. That's what Rabbi Eliezer is trying to reveal, that what you have to work on is just an inning of Ruvain, an inning of having better eyes to see it. But it's not be'etzem, the Rabbanu Shalom is far from you. That's the shirish of all hakar and the Rabbanu Shalom is to know that the Rabbanu Shalom that you're about to meet throughout Agadat and throughout Ein Yaakov is right in front of your face. Okay, should be zeicha to experience him and to only have gilum mishmaris, and the Rabbanu Shalom shouldn't cry over it anymore. We should be zeicha to experience it b'shlei musay, b'yas kol tzedek and here v'yimeinu.
We're still alive.